Hey, good evening, or good morning, or good whatever time it is where you are. I know we have people from around the world with us here. So, welcome to the first online academic lecture of 2026 for all members of Worcester College. My name is Colin Phillips, and I'm very happy to be hosting this event because I'm a Worcester Old member myself. I studied modern languages in the 1980s. Then I went to the US thanks to an exchange program that Worcester supported. I thought I was going for 9 months. It turned into 33 years. And 2 years ago, I returned to Oxford, where I'm now Professor of Linguistics and a Fellow of Somerville College, just down the street from Worcester. And that history is why I have an accent that's a little bit hard to place, something that's quite relevant to tonight's talk. What's linguistics? It's the scientific study of human language. We want to know what it is about the human brain that gives us this amazing ability to speak, understand, and learn any language that we're exposed to if we start early enough as a child. We're interested in the similarities and differences among the world's 7,000 languages, and we're interested in the historical development of languages. And we learn a lot from studying the fine-grained variation in how speakers of the same language talk and how they perceive one another. And this is where we get to turn to experts like our speaker tonight, Professor Devyani Sharma. Back when I was a student at Worcester, linguistics was barely a thing here in Oxford. Nowadays, it's a thriving and growing area, and I'm just thrilled that Devyani is one of our newest colleagues. For me, it's a bonus that she's at Worcester, which is near and dear to my heart. Devyani is one of the world's leading experts in sociolinguistics, which is a super interesting field that straddles the social sciences, humanities, and cognitive and computational sciences. Devyani started out in art. She studied at the Chelsea College of Art here in the UK before moving to the US, where she got a BA combining fine art, anthropology, and linguistics from Dartmouth, and then a PhD in linguistics from Stanford. Fortunately for us, Devyani then came back to the UK, where she was based in London for more than 20 years, mostly at Queen Mary, where she helped to build a world-class linguistics group. Devyani is particularly known for her work on accents and speech styles. As you know very well, accents are something that people in Britain are super sensitive to because of how they vary by region and by social background. But they also play different roles in countries around the world, and even their role in British society is shifting. Devyani has written lots of important academic works, of course, but she's also very much in demand beyond academia. She's been featured in all of your favorite print and TV news outlets. She's contributed her expertise to government, to big companies like Shell and Google, and to nonprofits as well. And she's the creator or co-creator of several online resources that help individuals and organizations understand the role of accents and accent bias, such as Accent Bias Britain and Multilingual Capital. Devyani now holds the professorship in language and communication endowed by News UK. This is a chair that has been connected to Worcester since 1993. It came a little too late for me to benefit. Devyani is also cross-appointed in two faculties, English and Linguistics, both of which now are based in the spectacular new Schwartzman Center for the Humanities, which opened up just a few months ago, just down Walton Street from Worcester. Next time you're in Oxford, you should, of course, visit Worcester, but I encourage you to also head down the street to check out the Schwartzman Center. Unlike most buildings in Oxford, it's open to the public, and starting in the spring, there'll be a fantastic series of theatre and music performances to enjoy. This corner of Oxford, next close to Worcester, is now really thriving. So some quick logistics before we start. Devyani is going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for follow-up questions. You can drop questions in the Q&A box on your screen at any time during or after the talk, and then I'll do my best to cover as many of them as we have time for. And Devyani is looking forward to hearing all your questions. So now let's turn it over to Devyani.
Thank you so much, Colin, and a warm greeting to everyone wherever you are. Unlike all of you and unlike Colin, I've only been with Worcester for one term, but I'm already feel quite embedded, and I was fortunate enough to meet many old members at an event last term, and I'm delighted to have a chance to speak to you today. As Colin said, please do share any thoughts, questions relating to what I'm talking about. It's a topic that people often have a view on, and I'll make sure we have time for discussion at the end. Just share my slides. Please do say if you're not able to see or hear at any point. Just make sure this is. As Colin mentioned, one of various projects that I currently work on is in the area of accent bias. And I thought it would be an interesting project to talk with all of you about. I'm not sure where all of you work, what sectors you work in, but as Colin said, this work has ended up being of interest to a number of different types of organizations. And at the end of the talk, I'll spend a few minutes talking about how we've engaged in very interesting and different ways with the corporate sector, with government departments, with public sector. And each of these workplaces, each of these organizations has a slightly different speech environment. So maybe you can think about yours while I'm talking. So the project I'm going to talk about has run for some years, and while we have the usual research agenda behind what we're looking at, this project in particular always had at its core a commitment to also share what we find with with employers and employees, especially young people who aspire to join elite professions from underrepresented backgrounds, but not to simply lecture without the knowledge. We were very committed to first understanding the situation in the UK. What evidence do we see or do we not see evidence for bias? And then engaging with employers and workplaces to see what's realistic and sharing what we found. So I'm going to talk about both sides. In fact, I'll keep it a little bit light on the details of the research. I'll show you a lot of findings, but I'll keep them like snapshots. But if you're interested in the specifics, I'm very happy to go into more detail. This is our team. So we had a multidisciplinary team, primarily linguists, but also a psychologist and representatives from law departments. And we worked in the north and south of England with law firms. The sector we focused on in this work was law. That was partly just feasibility. We needed to, you'll see with the materials we made, we needed to have a particular sector in mind. And law was one that has both had a history of sometimes barriers to access, but also a sector that's been addressing those in many ways in recent years. So it was a changing profession that we were interested in. But really what I'm talking about applies very broadly, but the focus is access to elite professions. Other workplaces will actually be quite different to what I'm talking about. And the focus is the UK, but I know some of you are not in the UK, and I'd be very happy to talk about how what I'm talking about does or doesn't apply elsewhere as well. So just to get started, let's think about the terms we're going to be using. Accent is something that you sometimes hear people saying, I don't have an accent, that person does have an accent, but everybody has an accent. It's the sound system you use when you're speaking. The reason we say sometimes that somebody doesn't have an accent is that that accent is the unmarked or the standard one. And we're referring to the non-standard ones when we say somebody has an accent. So we all have an accent. And crucially, we also have to say we all have bias. So when I do corporate talks, everybody in the room relaxes when I say that. So there's no angel who doesn't have automatic reactions, especially to voices which carry so much social information. Right now, you're listening to my voice and your brain has to process a lot of detail. So for fast processing, we do take shortcuts. Some of you I might sound like someone you know, and that's going to affect how you process my speech and how you process who I am. But when we put these together, we do have naturally triggered social stereotypes. That's going to happen. But when we start to rely on those stereotypes to judge independent traits like skills and competence, we fall into the territory of discrimination. So I'm going to use the word bias, but we're really going to be talking about when it gets problematic rather than the more psycholinguistic, the natural process of expectation-based processing, which is also a kind of bias. We're interested when today we're interested in how these stereotypes can interfere potentially problematically with independent judgments, especially when there are consequences at play. So one thing, another kind of introductory point to keep in mind is sometimes when I talk about this, people will say, oh no, another form of bias. We have so much training already, and I'll get to training with a slightly critical view of it. But it's important to remember when we talk about accent bias that it's not another type of bias. It's actually the root for the types of bias we already talk about. So it can be a root for bias against ethnicity. It can be a root for bias against gender, age. And so it's good to keep that in mind, that we talk a lot about protected characteristics, and accent signals those characteristics. So we don't want to separate it out. We should actually recognize that it's how we exercise some of that discrimination that we aim to avoid. Public awareness is interesting. It's much higher than it used to be. And in fact, a lot of the effects I'll talk about are much easier to talk about now. One of the things I'll share at the end is how much more engaged employers have been with the work we've been doing. In fact, pushing it further. And we take a fairly measured position, but it is still low in a sense that I'll talk about with our findings, which is although people are quite interested in and aware of accent difference and usually very accepting of accent difference, I think what we found interesting is how people still haven't thought about the extent to which they use that cue for social information about a person. But crucially, of course, and the data on the side is quite an old, very simple survey that was conducted that shows this discrepancy where people might admit that accent is a basis for judgment, and not really recognize that it might be leading to inequality of different types. So rather than telling employers, you should be good people, you should be generous, you should be open, we often say it's in the interest of an organization or an employer, if they want to hire and retain the best minds, to set aside bias that's based on personal characteristics. If nothing else, it's inefficient for the organization to be missing the most talented employees or potential employees. Obviously, there's also the social side and the impact on applicants that we'll be talking about. But even in the interest of an employer, this should be a concern. So very briefly, and I am going to go quite quickly through quite a few slides because I'll show you a number of different findings from separate studies. So apologies for going quite quickly, but I'm happy to pick up whatever you find to be of particular interest. But as I said, we focused on England, and the UK has an unusually sophisticated world of accent-based perception for hundreds of years. It's quite a fascinating history, and many writers and comedians have commented on how finely the English, well, across the UK, how finely people can, not necessarily negative judgment, though that too, but how finely people can place each other, and how much social information is packed into voice. What our interest was, as I said, much more applied, and the question of how does that translate when somebody is trying to break into a career in particular. And earlier work there has been much more work done on this in the US. In the UK, one report that interested us was not focused on accent, but it was focused on non-educational barriers to elite professions. And they had an interesting discussion in this report of these informal criteria, like does the person have polish? Does the person have cultural fit with what we want? If you picture a law firm, but it could be a number of other professions. And what they were talking about was a sense of something that's very unspecified: polish, talent, cultural fit. A sense of that as being professional, but the immediate risk that it's actually blended with social class. And so, especially if you have recruiters from a certain social class, there's a risk of recruiting in your own image because that's what you see as professionalism. So you can see the risk there. And we felt as linguists that accent is a big part of this process if it's happening, if it's an impediment to advancement and social mobility. So we wanted to look at this issue in workplaces, but specifically looking at accent. Although we looked at England specifically, I do want to mention, and many of you probably are experiencing this, workplaces, especially corporate and multinational workplaces, are incredibly globalized and diverse in terms of accents today. So this is just, we can come back to this especially if you're based outside the UK and want to talk more about it. But even here, we see a kind of a lag where you might have, as a reference for what sounds professional, a slightly older set of reference accents, when actually in the workplace you have a very different mix. But I'm not going to talk too much about all of these regions. We'll focus on the UK context. So past work has looked at a number of types of language-based bias. Non-native speakers have been studied, and also non-standard native speakers, and that's what we're interested in today. So speakers of English as a native language, but not the standard variety. So our starting point is to examine whether there's a narrow accent norm for gaining access to certain professions, and whether this creates asymmetric pressure on certain groups. But as I said, we wanted to check evidence for this. We don't want to assume it's the case. But just to give you a sense of how fine-tuned this situation is in England, Charlene White was the first Black woman to be a ITV News at 10 presenter. And she said about her own accent, "I don't have the South London accent anymore because my parents sent me to elocution lessons from the age of 9. I guess they had foresight." And I like this quote because of the high level of awareness of risk for speakers of certain accents, but also which is inevitable, the engagement in that system. So not, oh, I'm going to resist and fight back or anything. Parents looking out for their kids and feeling, let's try and conform to that narrow norm to maximize our child's success. So we see a fair bit of evidence in the UK that these pressures do apply to certain groups. It's changing very fast, so I do want to note that. As I said, we've done our project at a time when it's very interesting because some of these asymmetries are changing quite a lot. So what I'm going to do for a few minutes is take you through a number of findings in our research. So this project involved a number of separate studies. Most of everything that I'm presenting today is studies done with the general public. As I said, I won't give you a lot of detail of the research so that I can highlight the findings, but we aimed for representative samples across England and across the UK in different studies, so that the responses, just so that you know, it's not just London listeners, it's respondents across the UK. And I won't present all of the results for each study, just some kind of highlight findings. So we were asking, first of all, what are the attitudes to accents? These hadn't been looked at for a while within my field, sociolinguistics, but we were specifically interested in that applied question. Do these attitudes influence judgments of competence? They might not, so we don't want to assume that bias exists in these risky situations like job interviews, which will be my main focus. What we're really interested in is, would an underrepresented accent be heard as less qualified, even if the candidate gives the same answer? That's where you've really isolated the effect of an accent. And we talked to a lot of lawyers before we designed our studies. We work quite closely with several of the largest law firms in the UK. And we had very interesting reflections on the situation from lawyers. So this lawyer said that she did think that she might assume that someone with a more upper class accent might be better educated, more intelligent, more reliable. She also had this feeling that it's a snap judgment she didn't like seeing in herself, but that she felt it was still probably present in her responses to colleagues or applicants. So this is just to give you a sense of a starting point for looking at whether these effects are actually identifiable in the general public. So before I show you our results, because our studies focus quite narrowly on the job interview setting, again, for feasibility, because these are complex studies to design and we need to be selective, it's good to step back to start with and see that language-based bias can actually affect a young applicant at many stages of their career. We're only going to be talking about one narrow one. So even before interview, there's research that shows the name alone, of course, this isn't accent, can have an effect on callbacks, for example. We'll be talking about interviews and accent-based reactions. But something I don't have time to go into, but I do have some additional slides if you're interested in it. In interview, there are other conversational cues that can be can disadvantage certain interviewees. So I'll come back to that. But crucially, post-interview in the workplace, all of the effects I'm talking about can still exist. So we might be able to control some of these in interview. We actually found that people have quite a good ability to not act on biases that we found in the general public. But that doesn't mean they're not there, and you can actually have workplace bias, of the kind I'm talking about today, beyond the interview setting. In fact, we had quite a lot of people talk to us about leaving a career in law, especially from underrepresented social backgrounds, not because they didn't make it, they made it into the profession, but there was a cumulative sense of stress. So that's something to keep in mind. Even though we're talking about interviews, these effects can arise later as well. So I'm going to now take you through what we can call headlines from a number of different studies. So I'm sorry it will kind of hop from one finding to another, but I think it's more interesting to see a range of types of studies and types of findings. We work a lot with voice experiments, so playing voices of interview candidates. This initial finding is not to do with voice. It's a very simple survey. It's the kind of survey that the Sun would do or the Daily Mail, but we do it because we replicated a survey that was already replicated once in the past. So we were the third time point, which is just useful as a reference point. So we just gave labels of accents and saw how people rank them for prestige. Our data is the blue line, and you can see there's actually a bit of a flattening. But what's also striking is the consistent ordering. So British respondents really know the order, the place of accents. This kind of data doesn't tell us much at all about their personal attitudes, actually. They're just feeding back to us what they know about their society. But you can see what we call received pronunciation, the standard variety in the UK, is always ranked at the top. It's interesting to see French quite high ranked always. So you might have thought that native speakers will always rank above non-native speakers. But I guess you probably aren't surprised to see that French accents break through that and get ranked quite high. What we see lower ranked is working class accents, especially industrial cities of England, and minority ethnic accents. So we see a kind of prestige ranking intact over 50 years, but weakening. So this is just a reference point for us going forward. But what we were really interested in is when a listener knows that this is a high stakes situation, not this kind of decontextualized, what do you think of a German accent, but what do you think of this person? How are they doing in a job interview? Do these kinds of prestige rankings disappear because people realize they better not act on them, or do they interfere? So the second finding to note is that we did find that bias can affect whether people hear a job candidate as sounding competent, even when the interview response is identical. The way we do this is it's difficult to describe in a compact way, but the main thing to note is we don't play job candidate recordings, job interview responses next to each other that are identical. That would be extremely artificial. We just have enough participants that we can give them quite a realistic task. We just say you're going to hear a range of job interview responses. We worked with lawyers to develop the responses. And we ask them about competence, expertise, likelihood of success. So not about their accent, just about how they're doing in the interview. But because the sample is large enough, in our analysis, we can actually compare when this large group of listeners across the group, when they heard the same answer, was it ranked the same, which is what you would expect to see if there's no effect of accent. I hope that was clear. If not, I will come back to it. But I thought you might like to hear the accents because we had 10 different speakers, 10 different recordings to make it sound natural, and 10 different questions. We had to be selective about accents. We couldn't look at that long list that we saw earlier. So our design was to look at, first of all, working class against middle class accents in England. Then also the regional contrast. And then the third contrast that you see in this little table is with ethnicity. So within London accents, working class London accents, we had a more traditionally white vernacular. We've called it estuary English. It's towards the Cockney end of estuary English. So working class white, typically white speech. And a new accent dialect that's called multicultural London English. You've probably heard it if you live in the UK. So it's the new London accent, more associated originally with Black and Asian speakers, but now pretty widespread in London. If you hear, well, there are a lot of new young British Black actors and musicians from London who speak it. You hear it in advertising now, it's very widespread. So only multicultural London English had two native speakers of the accent who were Black. All the other speakers are white. They're all young, they're all similar age, similar background in terms of social class. So I'll play you a little clip from the participants listened to 30-second answers. So they were quite realistic as job interview responses. I'll just play you a short clip from one.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
I hope you could hear that. So that's received pronunciation. I'll play it again.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
General Northern is a middle-class Northern variant, so kind of the Northern standard, quite regionally hard to place.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Urban West Yorkshire English is the label we used for a working class Leeds accent.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
And the two London accents.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Okay, so hopefully you could hear those, and just speed up and go through a few results of this study and then a few more. So the first thing we found is there wasn't a simple effect of accent. It wasn't the case, this is over 1,000 respondents, that everyone downrates one of these accents listening to them in a job interview. It's a job interview for a trainee law, a trainee in a corporate law firm. But you see this emergence of lower evaluation of the two working class London voices. The bias did not arise among younger listeners. You can see these ratings are clustered together for younger listeners. Around the age of 45, it emerges. Listeners from the South were more biased in this direction, and listeners from higher social classes. It may seem like, in a way, that is a good thing. The younger listeners are not showing the bias that older listeners have. But other work we've done suggests that that's also a life stage effect. So I think both are happening. So actually accent bias is weakening quite quickly in a lot of contexts. But also as those young people age and enter the workforce and become recruiters themselves, they'll become more judgy. And it's possible we all went through that. And so it's actually that kind of teenage young person's idealism that we're seeing. And to some extent, they may change as they age, but a bit of both. Another finding, this is a separate study that is concerning. So remember, this graph that I've shown you is comparing identical interview responses. So the only difference was accent for these. So when we see a significant down rating of 2 accents, we can say it's probably the accent that judge the job candidate as less competent for a law job simply based on accent. Another concerning finding that I'm just mentioning briefly was we also tested how strong someone's accent is. It might be something you're thinking about. Maybe you have an accent that's underrepresented where you work, but it's mild, or you might feel that actually people react differently to whether you have a strong accent. But what we found, I'm not sure this is a kind of simplification of the finding, is that although for both northern accents that you heard and multicultural London English, the milder version was higher rated for a law trainee position, it wasn't a statistically significant difference for the older northern varieties. So listeners around the UK were more comfortable with a range of accent strength for northern speakers. But for this new accent, the working class multicultural London English, the 2 black speakers, there was a significant difference in whether they had a mild or strong version. In fact, the mild MLE, multicultural London English accent, was often the top rated accent for the law position. So this shows that it's not actually the accent. In fact, there's a kind of reward because there's a lot of diversity awareness and people are worried about these issues. There's a reward for sounding, like you're from a background that's underrepresented. But if the accent was too strong, there was a kind of penalty. So we see an intersection here between social class and ethnicity, where there's actually an added penalty happening for the new ethnic minority accent. I hope that was clear. I am going to get to some positive findings as well, but one very brief further finding, and this was something we were interested in also for theoretical reasons, because it's not done very much in research on language attitudes, is what happens while people are listening to somebody. So you might know the political polling that is sometimes done where you have a slider and you have to keep rating as you listen to somebody. This is again very simplified, but what we found was that for identical responses, again mixed up in the listeners, so they're not hearing them side by side. For identical responses, within 3 seconds, so 3 seconds is enough to know what accent you're hearing, but to not know what the person is saying. Within 3 seconds, we saw a significant difference in trajectory of a standard speaker, RP, and that new multicultural London English accent. But what's interesting that we found that's quite different to how language attitudes have been studied before is that what you're seeing here is an expert question. It was a question like, what's the difference between contracts and tort, which I had to learn before doing this research. So since it was a technical legal question, the listeners were hearing the MLE speak, and can you see how it curves up by the end of the response? So sometimes for many speakers, there was a convergence at the end. So if we just said rate this speaker, they would have had a similar rating. But when we look at real time, we see that there was a big risk for that MLE speaker until the expert content was heard. And in fact, when the question is non-expert, like tell us a time that you solved a problem, for older listeners, the MLE line stays low. So from a theory point of view, for us, this was interesting because a lot of attitudes research says you hear someone and you classify them, you put them in a category. But what you see here is a live updating of reactions. But you also see, relevant for this talk, the burden of proof for an MLE speaker to not mess up during the interview. They don't have that kind of free boost among the listeners. Before moving on to our practical exchanges and recommendations with employers, I want to show you a couple of positive findings that we had in our work. One of them is, I mentioned briefly that we included both expert responses and non-expert. This doesn't mean good and bad. It just means the question required some kind of expert knowledge, or it was a generic kind of question. And for all accents, job candidates got a boost when they were talking about expert content with listeners. So one very simple takeaway is when you have certain kinds of knowledge, that actually interacts with people, the biases people may bring to your accent. And it's a recognized effect in psychology that if a person doesn't have other details to focus their attention on, they'll fall back on the shortcuts and the stereotypes. But when their attention is absorbed by something else, those effects will be weaker. So we found it for expert knowledge, and we also found it for confidence. So in another study, I manipulated our recordings to add disfluency to make the person sound more hesitant and uncertain. And we found a much stronger effect for confidence, actually. The reason I did this was the lawyers we were working with said, we do think there's some people have accent bias, but confidence is a huge thing in hiring and in the profession. So I found this interesting, because as linguists, it's a risk that you just study the thing that you're interested in and say, oh, we found bias. But there might be a much stronger effect that you haven't bothered to show. And so you're exaggerating the role of accent bias. So here, actually, I changed how I talk to students who are applying and employers, saying actually confidence is a huge factor. And ironically, when people are self-conscious about their accent, they tend to mumble. And so our advice based on this is you should do the opposite. You should actually speak confidently, because people's stereotypes about your accent will get backgrounded. So I mentioned, just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to go be a bit brief on some of these. But one very interesting area, and not just for interviews, but many of you, all of you have meetings at work, you chair meetings. Accent can be one element in a whole system of communication and feedback to each other. So if your accents are very different, it often means your whole communication systems are quite different, just different cultures. And that can actually lead to unconsciously us favoring people who are more like us in a meeting, how much we look at them, whether we invite them to take the floor. So obviously in an interview, but also in workplaces, there can be a wider cultural distance effect that nobody intends and it isn't aware of, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Is it possible that you keep focusing on the people where it's a very natural human communicative tendency to you feel more harmonic with people who have the same way of being. So I wanted to just contextualize accent with the wider interactional bias that can arise unintentionally. I'm going to skip this final bit of evidence so that I have just a couple of minutes to talk about our engagement with employers. All the studies I've talked about until now have been on how people hear each other, how people hear accents. But we were commissioned by the Sutton Trust to also look at speakers. So do speaker testimonials correspond to what we've been seeing listeners doing? And just briefly, we see a lot of the same tendencies in the national surveys that we did. More bias against northern accents. In fact, the South that you see here for 20% is almost entirely London accents that we saw an effect of earlier. And on the right, there's this interesting SEG is socioeconomic group. Even senior managers experiencing singling out for accent, but interestingly, in social settings associated with work. So that can be kind of a kind of adjacent to the professional environment context where these things happen. So we have a number of testimonials. This is a very difficult area because we all like to, comment on each other's voices and accents and mimic each other. But so I feel like I spoil people's fun when I talk about this. But we're really just looking at the edge where it tips over into consequences for individuals. And it is troubling to see the kinds of themes that come out where you see open bias against somebody's voice in a promotion context. This NHS worker told me that one of the reasons I like talking to different employers and organizations is it's kind of off the agenda now, much less so. But he was saying if I mention it, it's like something I just made up because it's not really recognized as a potential issue. And at the end of this list, you can see issues with belonging that can arise personally. People might not even mention it as they go through a stage of work or studies. Another type of testimonial that was worth noting was not hearing your voice represented in the career that you're interested in going into. And I'll come back to this question of diverse voices. So there was some bad news that I've talked about, but bias has weakened. In fact, there were many places in the studies I've presented where there isn't a lot of bias. There was reduced bias in the voice experiments we did. But most interestingly, this type of bias was quite shallow and it could easily be displaced by expertise and confidence. And in a study I didn't talk about, we found that legal professionals who are very trained in recruiting and aware of these issues didn't show any of the biases that I've shown you for the general public. Doesn't mean they don't have them, but that it was fairly easy to set them aside. So very briefly, so that we have some time for discussion, we wanted to share what we've been finding with employers, which we started doing some years ago, but we didn't want to go and lecture people about what to do. We work in an ivory tower, and I learned a lot about how on the ground, how large firms work, and so we wanted to understand the dynamics of these work contexts, but also test whether any interventions we suggest actually work. So there's some skepticism of EDI training, snowballing, and there's quite a few studies that show it doesn't always have an effect. It can even have a negative effect where you do, so if you do gender bias awareness training, that after the training, people show even more bias for the different reasons why. So we wanted to test any kind of efficacy of any suggested interventions for workplaces before sharing them. So we worked with a psychologist. So in management studies and in psychology, there are quite a few explorations of ways to get employers and recruiters to focus on what's needed and ignore irrelevant information. So we tested these, and the one that showed the most effect on reducing accent-based differences. So we don't want the underrepresented accents to get rated higher. Maybe they're giving a bad answer. We just don't want accent to be a factor. The simplest one, just raising awareness, was the most effective. So I personally don't like to go into workplaces and say, oh, you should add a 20-minute. We do have a version of what I'm sharing with you today because quite a few places have requested that. But I don't think we should add a long training session. All we need to do is one sentence in recruiter training that says, by the way, people are known to use accent as a shorthand for assumptions about knowledge and skills. Focus on what people are saying and not how not their accent. So for us, it was interesting that this had an effect when we know that gender and race unconscious bias training is having less of an effect now. And I think the reason is people haven't, even if they're aware of accent differences, they haven't stopped to realize that they use it at times that they shouldn't, that they use accent information a little bit too much. So this was one finding that helped us give a realistic recommendation to employers, not time consuming and tested. But there is a limitation to this kind of training, which is you just make people aware of their biases. It doesn't eliminate skewed expectations or being, I can't believe someone with this accent has this role. That doesn't go away. You just become aware. What makes that go away is actually lifelong, long-term exposure to diverse accents. I always give the example of gender. So 50 years ago, women in a number of roles would have elicited similar surprise or negative reactions where a person didn't expect to see a woman in a role. That has changed a lot, and now we don't really register. It's just such a complete change. And I think many of you have probably experienced that for accent, where we no longer bother with the shortcuts and the stereotypes with accent because it's so diverse around us. We just focus on people's content. But there is actually, I think, still some awareness raising that's useful. So this is why we tend to say code switching or accent modification, although we always say it's fine, I'm doing it right now. So the way I'm talking to you is not the way I would talk to my dad. So we don't say don't do it, but if workplaces require it or expect it, that, oh, you should just switch to your work voice. One issue is that we erase that diversity of voices, so people continue to be surprised to hear a certain accent in a certain role. Another is that it's not equally easy. Some people shift and want to. Some have the willingness or interest, but some can't or don't want to. And so that's an added cognitive pressure. They're trying to do an interview or do some work, and they're actually trying to speak in a different way to their natural way, which is actually cognitively very taxing. It can be it can kind of deplete their attentional resources in quite an unfair way. So we work, I'll skip this one, I do want to stop, but the takeaways are quite simple. So, our recommendations, we publish these with the Sutton Trust, don't really involve a lot of training. It's more awareness, especially among employers, that there can be negative consequences simply because we're so immersed in accent stereotypes that we don't step back and be aware of them. So I've talked about these takeaways, but for speakers, it's actually quite a counterintuitive recommendation, which is we show evidence that you shouldn't really worry too much. There may be bias against your accent, but actually you should aim for confidence and expertise. It's still a double standard because you need that maybe sometimes to override somebody's bias. But increasingly with diverse workplaces, the expectation shouldn't be a single voice type, but expecting difference and learning to accommodate it. I won't go over the groups that I've worked with, but I put down a number of types of organizations I've worked with, just because you may be in some of these sectors and might have views to share. But I'll stop there and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Devyani. That was really fascinating. And we have several questions coming in already. There's lots and lots of things to ask about. One thing that interesting question that came up was about whether you see any kinds of effects of reverse bias, where there are cases of bias against traditionally prestigious varieties.
Yeah, we saw a little bit. I mentioned a study that we did in law firms. It's just it wasn't time to talk about that study, but we did a study in law firms where we gave them a harder task. So what I talked about here was quite simple. people just heard one version of a response. But with lawyers, we developed slightly better and slightly worse responses with a panel of lawyers in written form. Not brilliant and terrible, but just at the margin. And what we wanted to see was at the margin, if you have a standard accent, does it tip you over into being categorized as good? And, but they didn't at all act on biases. So it was a smaller study. We had about 61 lawyers do this. It's hard to get lawyers to do things. They're busy. But they did show there was a little bit of a down rating for the good response for received pronunciation. So it looks a bit like a higher bar. So it's not quite a reverse bias, but it was a little bit like slightly lower, but it wasn't statistically significant, but slightly lower. And also for friendliness and these kinds of ratings, we see received pronunciation lower. You can definitely be too posh. That was a big change in the last, few decades in the UK, although posh is coming back. So there are some signs that people are now proudly realigning with sounding more upper class. But I didn't talk about sectors like policing, like construction, where you can have genuine reversal, where you just don't go in with a received pronunciation accent. But I will say that our interest was social mobility. And I would say it's not quite a pure reversal. So I don't think standard accent speakers face the potential career disadvantages because of that, as underrepresented accents trying to move upwards. So I think there's a little bit of a difference when it reverses.
So there's some related questions coming up about whether people are uniform, similar in their reactions across your sample, or whether there's variation. So, for example, did you see differences by gender in terms of the people judging, or
Yeah.
did it make a difference whether the interviewers were themselves coming with diverse accents?
Right. So our data, because we had to isolate the accent effect, it's experimental data. So listeners were presented with a series of they would see the question and they would listen to the response given and judge how competent they sounded for the job. So they don't hear the interviewer, and we haven't studied interviewers. Even with the law firms, it was just graduate recruiters and lawyers doing a similar type of judging task. So we don't know. We just know reactions across the general public, as I've presented. But there were a lot of listener effects that I haven't talked about. A few that are quite there are quite a few. So I mentioned that they're quite predictable in the sense that as you go up the socioeconomic scale, you get more negative judgment. You have a predicted slightly more positive ratings by women. You have slightly more positive ratings by non-white respondents, though we have fewer numbers for that. There was a very funny effect that we didn't expect. So the study where we replicated a study from 50 years ago, we found many similar regional, so people from regions where the accent is disadvantaged were much more positive, so they recognized the disadvantage and they didn't negatively judge as much. But Scottish listeners, in the old study, they were kind of similar, but in this study, they downrated all the non-Scottish accents. It was I thought, oh, we're seeing Scottish politics of the last 50 years. It was a huge difference. But one last interesting example that is worth mentioning is so let's say a speaker from Birmingham or Black country, so regions that have very kind of aggravated stigmatization that they face that. When they saw the name of their accent, they themselves downrated it as less prestigious. But when they were given the label, an accent similar to my own, they rate it high. It's quite kind of poignant, I think. So people will recognize the social bias against the accent if you give the label of the accent, because it reminds them of their region. But across the board, 50 years ago and now, almost everyone rates the phrase "an accent similar to my own" high, because it's you and your mum and your. So it's a bit sad that you see that individual acceptance, but recognition of social bias.
So there's a really interesting question that I think I'm just going to read verbatim because it's related to what you were just talking about. It's very interesting. So this person says, I was born in Lancaster and had a local accent. Now I live near Oxford and speak truly posh RP. When in the North, I always send my wife with a mid-Atlantic accent to get quotes and things like that, because the assumption of vendors is that I'm better able to pay more than she and others with non-RP accents are. Not everything is in our favor, unquote.
Yes. I don't really have anything to say to that, but that's true. That's what I said, that actually there are plenty of these kinds of reverse bias instances, but I think on balance, the negative outcomes for social groups are on a different scale, but I
Mhm.
accept that definitely. There was a very interesting discussion about how gender intersects as well with accent. I don't know if anyone asked about it, but people are much more negative about women with regional accents, for instance. So sports commentators, MPs, women with regional accents, Jess Phillips, Alex Scott, a football commentator, get very negative judgments, but their male counterpart, so there's also an intersection there with whether
Mhm.
you're a man or a woman.
So you spoke mostly about the accents focusing on sounds, but we know there's also a lot of variation that goes into other parts of dialects.
Mm.
So as far as you can tell, do those basically track each other, or are there differences between specifically accent type effects and other dialect features?
Um, well, um, in the context we're talking about, which is a kind of professional environment, especially judging competence for promotion or employment, I think we didn't test syntax, lexicon, grammar and words because we had to isolate the effect of accent. So we made everything else completely standard grammar, same texts. Um, it's there would be some variation. So there's some grammatical variation that people tolerate, but certain non-standard grammatical or discourse, like using the discourse marker like, saying, well, I was like, whatever. They are like shibboleths and they can have a much worse effect than accent, So I think that actually grammatical and lexical variation would have a wider range of reactions, but there are definitely some that would be red flags, much more than
Mhm.
accent features. Yeah.
So, an interesting one that came in is about the relationship between intelligibility and prestige. So, is
Mhm.
it the case that intelligibility, so the prestige tracks intelligibility, or are they kind of separate?
Intelligibility it's a great question. One element of intelligibility is exposure and familiarity. So it's actually quite, accents don't per se have a level of intelligibility, but it would be wrong to make this completely about attitudes, social attitudes. There are intelligibility effects, but they are not quite as predictable as aligning with the prestige hierarchy. So a French accent is not that intelligible for someone who's not been exposed to a lot of French speakers. So, but it we did some studies also looking at whether familiarity makes a difference, which it does. And it's very hard to tease apart actually whether it's a difficulty or a negative bias. But I should mention when we talk about it, I think that it is true in workplaces that you can have an extreme end where intelligibility is the problem. And I don't like to deny that. So sociolinguists often talk about this more as ideologies about each other. But there are genuine situations where we need to work on understanding the different accent. But there's a lot of research to show that expecting to not understand leads you to not understand. So that's also something to bear in mind. There are really clear studies where the same recording was played, just the face of a different person, and people did worse on an exam in a university after because they were expecting a white American lecturer versus a Korean lecturer, and they expected to not understand and did badly on the test. So expectation can be a big factor as well. But
Mm.
yeah.
We've got a couple of different questions relating to how representative you think this situation is of Britain versus how much it generalizes. So
Mhm.
would you see the same things in Germany, India, China,
Mm.
uh, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the UK, in some ways, is it's it's made a fine art of accent difference and prestige links to that. But one interesting contrast to the US, where a lot more work has been done in not always by linguists, often in management studies, and more on non-native accents, is that a stereotype of the two countries is that the UK is more organized around social class and the US is prestige is more organized around race. And there are studies showing more stronger racialized effects in the US. So one difference is what are the reference points in the culture for prestige? And they are actually quite different with the US and UK. Not to say the other isn't at play in either one, but you see that. In places like India, it's very different. It's not absent, these kinds of effects, but when you look at the UK and the US, you're seeing monolingual effects. It's a bit like humans want to organize according to prestige. So if they have only one language, they'll stretch it out and have a hierarchy with that. If there are many, then the languages themselves have prestige. So in multilingual countries, sometimes you see a bit less of the accent-based organization because so many people. So if you look at Hindi in India, many Hindi speakers have another first language or another multiple other languages. So they'll have a Bengali accent, Gujarati accent. You see politicians with all kinds. So it's a bit different because there's a recognition that it's not always the first language. But you still see, yeah, you see versions of this. So in a way, it's a mirror on the cultural shape of the country in question.
So I know we're just past the hour,
Yeah.
but maybe we'll have just one or two more. So one thing that's come up in a couple of different ways points to what you were saying about awareness of bias versus eliminating bias. So to what extent do you feel that what's been changing is changes in actual attitudes or is changes in people's ability to control or police their attitudes?
Mm. Meaning that they've kind of gone underground or
Yeah. So it's about consciousness of these things. Yeah.
mhm. I think there's genuine change. We see I've been very surprised, pleasantly surprised when I worked. And we actually didn't really, we just put out some of our findings and said we're open to, but a lot of organizations came to us with an interest. I think there's been a lot of EDI awareness in general, diversity, inclusion, what shape does it take? And accent is an amazingly specific way in which all of these forms of exclusion or inclusion take place. So I personally think for the most part, the engagement that I've seen among employers is not just if I've understood the question right, it's not just feeling that you can't any longer say, but actually you still retain the bias. I genuinely think workplaces have changed a lot and people are more and more comfortable with the diversity, and it's a genuinely open discussion of what's the best way to, maintain a little awareness of how that diversity might create risk for some people. Is that what the question
Yeah, I
was?
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it's a little kind of rose-tinted glasses of me, but it's been really nice to work with all of these firms who themselves come up with ideas for how how to go about it. There's a clear age pattern. So I've had very interesting conversations in panels where CEO level people with underrepresented backgrounds said, I totally changed my accent when I was younger and I totally went back to it when I was more senior. And you can't really unravel whether it just became possible or they made it because they did that when they were younger. So there's some age differences.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, that leaves us with a fairly optimistic
Mm,
point to end on, I think. So, if hopefully, based on what you were saying, this can be maybe a self-correcting kind of situation.
mm,
As people are exposed to a wider range of accents in
mhm.
these situations, then maybe then we'll see progress on that in the way that you talked about. progress in attitudes towards gendered voices over the last 50 years. So I think we're going to wrap up here now. And we want to thank Devyani for a fascinating lecture and thank all of you for coming along and for contributing all your questions. Make sure you look out for your emails from the Worcester alumni team for what are other upcoming attractions, both online through more lectures and other fun things to bring you to Oxford. So thank you all very much and good night.
Thanks so much.